Thank you all for braving the non-snow to get here today. I really appreciate that. Before I get started, I would like to thank Alan for putting me on the schedule, and as well as Ralph Nazarian and my beautiful wife Kimmy for helping me set up. So it was very much appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, when we think of Warner Brothers, I think what we mostly think of is the crest, right? The Warner Brothers emblem, or we think about the huge movie monstrosity, the big entertainment Goliath that's down there in Burbank. But what we really should think about, and what we'll be pointing out today, is they were the Warner Brothers. They were actually four guys named Warner. We kind of forget that. Here's a picture of them. All right, this is, and I hope my pointer works here. This is the Warner Brothers. This was taken about 1920. By this time, they had already been in the filmmaking business about 20 years. On the left here, we have Harry, we have Jack, we have Sam, and we have Albert. We'll talk more about each of them. The thing that I think most people don't realize, because this guy, Jack, was such a self-promoter, oftentimes if you think of the history of Warner Brothers, if you know anything about it, you'll think Jack Warner and not really know about the other guys. But they all made significant contributions to what we know of today as Warner Brothers. This is the Warner family. This was taken about 1921. This is a picture from Motion Picture News. And by the way, all the pictures you'll see today are in my book. We'll have a few copies to sell afterwards if you're interested. Now, I think this is very interesting. This was Motion Picture News. This was honoring the Warner family. Now, if you look here, I just showed you a picture of four Warner brothers. Well, this one actually has five. There's actually another brother here, David Warner. He didn't have anything to do with the motion picture industry. He was probably the happiest Warner brother as a result. The thing that always cracks me up about this is the boss of them all, Ma Warner. And if you look at that face, you really believe it. The Warners were actually from Eastern Europe. They were from Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And they immigrated here to kind of get away from poverty and also the constant threat of terror from the Tsar. Dad over here, Benjamin Warner, he actually came over in the late, I think it was the late 1880s, got a job, and eventually brought the rest of the family over. There was some mystery as to what the Warner name was for a long time. It was actually just discovered recently, as a matter of fact. The real name was the Wanskalauzers. Okay, so you can see why they Americanized it to Warner. Okay, so how did the Warner Brothers get into the movie business? Well, basically, they used kind of the advantages of disadvantage, if you want to call it that, to get into the film business. These were immigrants. They had nothing. They came here. They were peddlers. They had no formal education. Now, you would think that that would really limit them in their options. What they did was they actually used it to their advantage by working in a lot of trades that actually prepared them for the rough and tumble world of Hollywood. They didn't know it, but it did, like sales. And the fact that they didn't have a lot of formal education meant that they could basically go on a hunch and move quickly in that direction. They also decided to work as a family, so they weren't out there all by themselves. They had a support group. What they did was, Albert, who was the second to oldest Warner brother, he was actually a very good salesman, and he sold soap. He was in Pittsburgh. Now, by this time, the family had moved to Youngstown, Ohio. They had migrated all over the East Coast, depending on where their dad could sell his wares. He was a peddler. And they ended up in Youngstown, Ohio. Albert took off from the family and became a soap salesman. He was in Pittsburgh. He happened to have a break, and he went and he saw a Nickelodeon. People lined up to go into one of these makeshift theaters. He went in. He was so smitten by all these sepia-toned images being projected on a stretched bed sheet that he shot back to Youngstown, and he said to everyone in the family, "Listen, I found the business we have to get into. This is the next big thing." Now, what he was surprised to find out was that two of his other brothers had come to the same conclusion independently. That would be Harry and Sam. The three oldest Warner brothers now were saying, we got to get into the film business. Turns out they had a friend who owned a kinetoscope, which was a very early Thomas Edison hand-cranked film projector. And he also had a ragged copy of the Great Train Robbery. And he was asking $1,000 for them to purchase this. Now, that's a huge amount of money, about 1903, okay? Well, they were very frugal people. They had saved well, and they pooled their money together, and they came out $175 short, okay? Their friend wouldn't budge. They had to come up with the extra cash, so their father threw in a gold watch and their family horse, and that's how they got into the film business. So for the next several months, the brothers took their kinetoscope, took their copy of their one film, and they went all over the eastern United States, hopping trains, going to minor camps, stretching a sheet up, renting a hall, probably like this, and showing their film. They made so much money, at a nickel at a time, that they were able to buy their own theater, which is the Cascade Theater. This is the Cascade Theater in 1907. If you look over here, there's actually Harry Warner in the picture. This was in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, just across the state line from where they lived in Ohio. They didn't own it at first. They couldn't afford to buy it. Actually, they couldn't even afford to rent chairs. What they did was they rented the hall, they fixed it up as best they could, and they made a deal with a funeral home that his family, the funeral director and his family, could come to any movie they wanted to as long as they would let them borrow the chairs, with the understanding that if there was a big funeral, the chairs would take off, okay? And it happened to them a couple times, as a matter of fact. They had to close down shop to give the chairs back. They made enough from the Cascade that they were able to sell it and get into the film distribution business. They went from, very wisely, they said, if we just have a theater and we show a film, we're only going to make this much money. But if we own a lot of films that we can send to a lot of theaters, we can make a lot of money. And that's what they did. They created what was called a film exchange on the East Coast, and they were very successful until Thomas Edison, who we think of as the great inventor. Thomas Edison was also very, very adamant about enforcing his patents. And some of these patents were probably even illegal. Like, for instance, there was what's called the Motion Picture Trust. What this was Edison formed a conglomerate of producers and distributors that had to pay Edison a huge license fee, and only they could distribute films, at least Edison films and films made with Edison equipment, that kind of thing. It was eventually broken up by the Supreme Court, but for a while there, Edison was really a bully, and he would send out thugs all over the place to break up non-licensed filmmakers and distributors, one of them being the Warner Brothers. So they were quickly put out of business. But they were not the type of guys who would take that kind of thing lying down. They said, all right, okay, we can't be distributors, let's be producers. So what they did was they got enough money together, and they started making films on the East Coast. Somehow, they got enough money to buy the rights to one of the biggest books of the World War I era, called My 4 Years in Germany. And I think they paid $50,000 for this book, and they made the film, and they made back between $1.5 million and $2 million. So now they're in the money, right? But mostly while they were in the East Coast, they were kept afloat by making a lot of cliffhangers. Also, they made, and this is was always something that Jack was embarrassed about, but they made a film. The first real hit was a film where they warned World War I soldiers about the dangers of venereal disease. And Jack was always embarrassed by it because that was his one and only starring role ever. Well, anyway, they made enough money on the East Coast because of My 4 Years in Germany and the VD films and things like that to eventually come west. Now, they didn't have any property here, so what they did was they rented space from other producers, and this was one of the first ones. This is called the Bostock Jungle and Film Company. This was downtown LA, hard to believe. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Schutz Park, but this was the site of one of the very first amusement parks on the West Coast. There was attractions, rides. The Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League, they actually played their games in an adjacent field, and they had a zoo. Now, this zoo, the owner would actually charge people admission to come see the zoo animals, And then he would also charge producers to come and make jungle movies. And that's what the Warner Brothers did when they first came to Hollywood. They would go to the Bostock Jungle and Film Company and make jungle films. Sadly, this is a parking lot today. Not a trace of it exists, which is really sad. They were successful enough doing this, and they kept afloat just enough that they were able to go to their next real home, which was in Studio City. Now, this is the Romaine Superfilm Studios. This is basically where MGM is today, very close. Jack Warner hated this place. He actually called it a dump. And to be fair to Jack, Jack lied a lot, but he was probably being honest on this one because it was a dump. This is where they used to dump all their old sets. So there was actually a big pile of rubble there. Once again, they kept afloat enough to make it to Hollywood. Wow, right? They've made it to the big time. Well, not quite. They're actually on a section of Hollywood called Poverty Row. And this was one of the first places they worked, which this is right on Sunset Boulevard, by the way. This is Gordon Street Studios. They rented space here. This is a picture of extras trying to get a day's work. Now, the thing I love about this picture is this poor guy right there. It's like anybody who's ever tried to get a job in Hollywood, they know what that guy feels like, right? The guy who owned the jungle, the Bostock Jungle and Film Company, was a guy named David Horsley. His brother actually owned a studio in Hollywood. Right here it is, the William Horsley Studios. It actually still exists. This building is still there right on Sunset Boulevard. William Horsley also owned this building over there, which also still exists. It was a film laboratory. The company actually still exists. It's actually the oldest existing company in Hollywood. I can't remember the name of it, but it's still there if you want to look. But he rented out part of the building to make movies, and that's where the Warners made movies for a couple years in the late 1919, 1920, right in there. They're making enough money, though, that they're looking for a home, one of their own. So there just so happened to be a open lot that was 2 blocks away, big field. They came in there. The family that owned this was called the Biesemeyers. They distrusted banks, and so they said, we will sell this property to you for $25,000, but you have to pay for it in gold coins. So the story was that Harry Warner every month would pay the mortgage by taking over a bag of gold coins to the Biesemeyers. All right, this is kind of funny. You see here, Warner Brothers West Coast Studios. Now that's complete marketing because there was no East Coast Studios. This was it, right? I'll show you this next picture. Okay, here's the front of the studio. Now this is kind of amazing. I think this is the picture I want to show you. Okay, look at this. 2 years later, that's all. All right, let's go back one or a couple. You got this empty field. So this gives you an idea of how quickly movies were exploding right then, right? Okay, here we are. They went from having this empty field to having a 10-acre fiction factory. Was the name I was just told by someone, which I thought was really good. Now, where is this building? Well, if you go onto Sunset Boulevard, the 101 freeway is right here. This all still exists. It's been through several different owners. We'll talk more about that. But Warner Brothers Cartoons, those all came from an area back here called Termite Terrace. All right. Anyway, this neoclassical building is still there. You'll see it right on Sunset Boulevard. Now, you may be wondering what happened to the barn that you saw a couple frames ago. It's right there. Okay? So they just built this big building right in front of it. This building later on became the site of the very first talkie film. So that barn out in the middle of the field actually was incredibly significant for Hollywood history. We'll get to that in a moment. All right, another picture of the building. Looks remarkably the same today, right on Sunset. All right, here's the Warner Brothers 1921. Now, by the time this picture was done, they'd been in the business for already about 20 years. Pretty amazing. I mean, when you consider that they I'll say this up front. I don't think I would have liked the Warner Brothers as people. I think they were pretty rough and tumble guys. But you have to admire what they were able to do in a generation. I mean, literally, they were coming from Eastern Europe 20 years earlier, and here they are being movie moguls within a generation. Just amazing. This was actually taken in New York at Albert's office. These two guys, the Warner Brothers didn't like each other very much. Let's put that right out there at the very beginning, especially these two guys, Harry and Jack. Jack really couldn't get along with anybody for very long, so it's not too unbelievable. But Harry was the big brother, and he always kind of had a little brother complex against Harry. Harry was also the president of Warner Brothers. Jack was the head of production for the Warner Brothers studios, but Harry was actually the president of the company. Jack did not like ever having to ask permission for anything, especially from his older brother. What I think is interesting about this picture is it's taken in New York. Like I said, the Warner Brothers, especially Harry and Jack, didn't like each other very much. Harry actually moved his office to New York to be a continent away from Jack. That's how much they really detested each other. There's Jack, looking very smug. Yeah. You know, pretty amazing. This guy was a studio head longer than anybody in history, something like close to 65, 70 years. I mean, something amazing. And he produced thousands of hit films. So, I mean, there was a lot of just natural intelligence because there really was no formal schooling. But a lot of people looked on him as an absolute tyrant, some others as a visionary. Now, I mentioned how they went from that little barn to a big, huge 10-acre lot. Here's how they did it, actually. It wasn't these three guys. I mean, here's Jack. Here's Darryl Zanuck. Although Darryl Zanuck was a genius, he had an incredible career, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it wasn't this guy. This guy was an animal trainer. What it was this guy, Rin Tin Tin. He was the one that saved the studio. Now, Rin Tin Tin, I'll tell you the story. This guy's name is Lee Duncan. He was the guy who discovered Renty. That was his nickname for him. He was a dog trainer who went off to World War I. He discovered a couple of German Shepherd puppies in a trench. They were shell-shocked. He nursed them back to health. One eventually passed away, but he was able to rescue Renty. He named him Rin Tin Tin. It was a child's puppet in France at the time. It turned out that Renty was an incredible find because he was an amazingly intelligent dog, an amazingly athletic dog. I think he might still hold some world records for leaping. He was able to leap tall buildings, amazing dog. Well, anyway, Darryl Zanuck, who later was the founder of 20th Century Fox, started his Hollywood career by writing scripts for Rin Tin Tin. And they were incredibly successful to the point that it's said that Jack Warner paid Rin Tin Tin $6,000 a week. Yeah, right, yeah. But he was the biggest star in the world, biggest action star. He kept the lights lit at Sunset and Bronson for a lot of years. All right, the other thing about the Warner Brothers character that really helped propel them to the front ranks of Hollywood was their gambling. Okay, they like to take the big gamble. All right. Now you got to remember they were second-tier producers, maybe third-tier producers. They were still little guys, and they decided that if they wanted to ever be into the ranks of the big boys, they had to take some big risks. So their first big risk happened around 1925 or so. They looked out and they saw the film company Vitagraph. Now, Vitagraph was one of the founding companies in all of film history. It had been around forever, but they had run into some financial problems, and they needed infusion of cash. The Warner Brothers said, okay, let's talk some bankers into funding us and let's buy it. So they did. When they did that, they were able to acquire Vitagraph's film library, which is what they really wanted. Plus, they also got a couple studios. This one was the Vitagraph studio in East Hollywood. It still exists as well. It's called Prospect Studios today. It's back here. As a matter of fact, our buddy on the hill, William S. Hart, used to make a lot of his cowboy movies up here. Let me show you what it looks like now. Well, actually, this is the front of the gate. You can see they already put the Warner Brothers name on it. A lot of game shows are done there. It's owned by Disney now. Also, a lot of TV shows, soap operas, and a few other TV shows. Grey's Anatomy was done there. So it's still a working studio in East Hollywood. They also got a a Vitagraph studio in Brooklyn. And this is what it looks like sort of now, actually. It still looks pretty much the same. This is now a Jewish girls' school. But if you look over here, you'll see a smokestack, which you can't read it, but it still says Vitagraph. And if you drive down the Long Island Expressway, I'm told that you can still see it if you know where to look. It's still there. All right, here's their next big gamble. 1925, the Warner Brothers came up with, they decided to get into radio, okay? So they bought KFWB. Now, Jack Warner always said that KFWB stood for Keep Filming Warner Brothers. Some other people said Keep Fighting Warner Brothers, especially these guys, because they were always fighting. It was apocryphal. It never happened. What happened was when they bought the name KFWB, it was just the next one in the list. There was actually a KFWA and a KFWC that were issued that same day. But anyway, KFWB, this was at the Hollywood studios there. They, three of the brothers decided, okay, we'll get into radio as a marketing tool for the Warner Brothers films. One of the brothers, Sam Warner, had other ideas. Now, Sam was the most technologically minded of all of them. He was probably also the most likable of all of them. He was the guy that everybody could get along with. He was actually on hand and actually got in there and got his hands dirty when they were setting up KFWB studios on the Hollywood lot. He actually worked with one of the engineers setting up the nuts and bolts of putting together a radio station. And while he was doing that, that same producer told him about a process that he was working on to synchronize sound with film, okay? Now, got to remember, everything being done at this point was, they were silence. So anyway, when it came to distributing films and presenting them, silence were king, and it looked like they were there to stay. Well, Sam Warner convinced his brothers that this was the really big gamble they needed to take to join the ranks of the big boys. Now, it was a tough sell. As a matter of fact, Sam got so frustrated that he quit the company and was just about to sign on with, I think, Universal, and got talked out of it. But he eventually convinced his other brothers that sound was where the future was at, and they decided to take the big jump. They bought this process that the engineer had told Sam about. They named it Vitaphone to take advantage of the Vitagraph purchase they had just made. Here was the first Vitaphone film. Now, this is Don Juan, 1926. This was not a talkie. This was still a silent film, but they used the Vitaphone process to actually put sound effects. It was a swashbuckling film, so they had sword fights, that kind of thing. So you'd hear the swords hitting, and you would also hear the orchestra as the background music. Now, this was something new because always before you had to have a live orchestra in the theater to actually hear it on a film, right? John Barrymore was a Shakespearean actor. He didn't like motion pictures. Also, always looked down on them, saying that they were not worthy of his talent, but he knew that he was making Hollywood history, so for the one and only time, he really behaved himself on a set. Here he is with the set. This was done in Hollywood. You'll see John Barrymore there, and Jack Warner always had to get his face in the pictures, right? They actually decided, okay, they're going to make one more big gamble with sound, and that was the jazz singer. Now, this happened about a year and a half later. It was a monster. I mean, it was the avatar of its day. Al Jolson was the star, and he was not actually supposed to speak in The Jazz Singer. He was supposed to sing, but he went off script like he always did because he was a real ham, and he started speaking, and he did that, wait a minute, you ain't seen nothing yet kind of thing. Anyway, it was really the end of silent films. I mean, they kept going for a while. As a matter of fact, Modern Times, which we talked about earlier, was almost 10 years later. It took the Warner Brothers from the second tier level all the way to the level of the big boys. They followed this up. Now, they had a head start because they were the ones who had rewired their theaters. Other movie houses hadn't done this yet. They were actually hoping the Warner Brothers would fail so they wouldn't have to do it. But the Warner Brothers had a couple-year head start. They started cranking out talkie after talkie after talkie. These things were unbelievably popular. As a matter of fact, Al Jolson made several for Warner Brothers. Actually, he made one here called Mammy, which was kind of a sequel to this, actually in the train station. When the train station was up at across from the Saugus Cafe, there's a scene where he sings Mammy from the back of the train, which is at the train station. The Warner Brothers were able to bank on their success and borrow unbearable amounts of money to buy their way into the ranks of the big boys. We'll talk about that in a moment, but in something that you can only call an untimely death. I showed you the picture back here of the premiere. This is the world premiere of The Jazz Singer. 4 people that were not there that night were the Warner Brothers. And the reason was because Sam Warner, once again, the most technologically minded, the most likable, and the one who actually got the brothers to move into sound, he died 24 hours earlier. He died just one day before the premiere of his baby. Okay, the reason was because he had worked so hard to get this thing to the screen that it ruined his health. He ignored some symptoms he had, and he died of a brain aneurysm a day before, The Jazz Singer hit the screen. Okay, 2 of the biggest egos to ever show up in one photograph, Jack Warner and Al Jolson. Like I said, Al Jolson was the biggest star in the world. He was, of course, the star of The Jazz Singer. Jack Warner wanted to be Al Jolson. This was probably the only guy he ever envied in history. And the reason was very simple. I mean, they both had very similar backgrounds. They were both Jewish immigrants. They both looked to show business to get them out of poverty. And whereas Al Jolson was considered the world's greatest entertainer, Jack Warner was a singer in vaudeville as a young man named Leon Zawardo. Okay, so there was a big gap in their in how their careers went in singing. Okay, now I mentioned to you that the Warner Brothers made so much money on The Jazz Singer and the follow-up films that they were able to move to the ranks of the big time. Where was the big time? Well, it doesn't look like it, but it was here. Okay, this is actually the David Burbank ranch house. Now, when you talk about Burbank, a lot of people think that Burbank, the city, was named after Luther Burbank. It was actually named after this guy, David Burbank, who was a dentist and a rancher. Okay, he owned a big plot of land. If you want to know where this is actually right where NBC Studios is today, where the house is. He owned a plot of land. A big company, a big film producer named First National, had already bought this piece of land and had started a studio. And here's one of the first pictures of it. The company is called First National Studios. They were actually one of the premier producers. They had moved up out of Hollywood 6 miles up the road to Burbank. Now, for those of you who know the landscape of the area, this right here basically would be the 134, okay? This is now the Warner Brothers Studios. Let's see, I think NBC would be about there. You got Disney over here, so the landscape's changed quite a bit. But in 1926, this was it. First National, they had only distributed films up to now, but they said, we want to move into production as well. They built this studio. They overextended themselves. They found themselves in financial difficulties. Warner Brothers, they're the rising stars on the block, right? They are able to raise, and the numbers I've heard have varied between $100 million and $250 million. I mean, when you think about that in 1926 dollars, right? But they bought First National. It was like an ant swallowing an elephant, okay? Because this was a little guy swallowing, a big, huge Hollywood producer. So this is actually when they first started building the studio, 1926. I put these on there because if you ever go down to the studio, and a lot of people don't know this, but you can. Warner Brothers actually has a tour, VIP tours. Everybody knows about Universal. Universal, you go there, it's kind of a theme park, right? You go to Warner Brothers, it's an actual working studio. You go on there, you get on a tram, you go around, you see stars walking by, you go into productions. It's really cool. If you go there on Thursdays, you'll actually see my wife Kimmy and I there because we still go there to work as docents in the museum, which is really cool because you get to play with all the cool Harry Potter stuff and the Casablanca stuff and all. It's really neat. But when you go there, you'll notice the buildings still look pretty much the same. Okay, this is a collage showing some of the films they were making in the mid-30s. Got a new decade. The Warner Brothers were almost put out of business right after they became the big boys with the stock market crash. They were able to survive it. At one point, they were $14-15 million in debt, you know, in 1931, something like that. I mean, amazing. But they were able to survive it. This picture is kind of interesting because it's one of the last pictures I ever see. You can't see it from there, but it says Warner Brothers with brothers spelled out. As you probably don't realize, but whenever you see Warner Brothers written, it's B-R-O-S, okay? If you ever work at the studio and you accidentally type Warner Brothers out, you get a nasty little email coming back to you. You know, it's not brothers, it's bros, you know? So this is one of the last times you'll ever see that. This is the Barham Gate. This is actually the main gate that people go into from Barham. It looks relatively the same, except for the water tower here. Now, we know the Warner Brothers water tower from Animaniacs and all the other things. It used to be here at this location. This was actually Vitagraph, or First National and Vitagraph logos on it. It was actually a working water tower at that time. It has since been moved, so if you go to Hollywood Way and look down south, you'll see the Warner Brothers water tower. It's now an empty icon. There's no water in it. It's just there as kind of their logo. Now, this picture is from 1933. You might not recognize it from here, but here it is 4 decades later. Remember that from Blazing Saddles? When they all run out the same gate at the end. You'll see that here there's a little bit more foliage and the water tower is gone. But that's still the main entrance into the lot. All right, now Warner Brothers, like I said, they had a head start from their talkies. And whenever you think of the big Busby Berkeley type musicals, you think MGM, you know, those kind of, I do anyway. But actually Warner Brothers was where the first big musicals started. And why not? Because they were the ones really, the real premier studio for sound. This is a scene from Gold Diggers of 1933, which I love. It still holds up really well. One of the things I really love about this movie is Ginger Rogers, who's right there, she sings "We're in the Money" in Pig Latin, which is great. And I like to think that this was the day they were recording it, because this was done on one of the recording studios, as you can see. All right, now I told you about Cosmopolitan Pictures. Cosmopolitan was owned by William Randolph Hearst, okay? William Randolph Hearst, we know him from the Hearst Castle. He was also a studio owner, and he had his girlfriend, mistress, Marion Davies. She was actually a great comedian, but he wanted to make her a dramatic star. And he had the money to at least try. It never really happened, but he tried. Put a lot of money into it. He started Cosmopolitan Pictures to basically do this. Now, Cosmopolitan was for a long time at another studio. They signed a deal with Warner Brothers, and they moved over to Warner Brothers for a couple years in the mid-30s. Now, one of the first films that they wanted to do was called Cain and Mabel. This was one of the first big Busby Berkeley musicals. Now, they didn't feel like they couldn't find a stage that was big enough. So, and Hearst had all the money in the world, right? So what did he do? He raised the roof, literally. They jacked the whole soundstage up 35 feet. Here's a picture of some very brave souls inside of it while they're jacking it up 35 feet. You know, and when you go there, it's stage 16 today, and there's this one stage that's taller than the rest, and that's why it's the lasting legacy of Cosmopolitan. Oh, this is cool. There's Marion Davies there, and Clark Gable, and Lloyd Bacon, who was the director of Cain and Mabel. I mean, they'd never seen this either, right? So they're out there to watch the roof being raised, which I think is pretty cool. Here's a picture from right after it was done. This is stage 7 back then. Like I said, 16 today. As a matter of fact, when you look at a Warner Brothers movie now, and you know how it starts and the crest turns, and you see the big Warner Brothers logo, that's actually on this side, the other side of stage 16. You'll see here there's some supports here that jut out. If you go there today, if you wonder why that is, that's because they had to raise it 35 feet, and that's how they support it. All right, Warner Brothers moved out of the big musicals to the gangster films in the 30s. And these were two of the biggest wise guys. You have George Raft and Edward G. Robinson. Now, George Raft would have probably become a gangster had he not portrayed one on film. Edward G. Robinson was actually a very cultured art aficionado. He actually hated the sound of gunfire. So it's kind of strange how he ended up with his career. A short time later, Warner Brothers actually even started moving away from the gangster films, this guy showed up from Tasmania, Errol Flynn, and he started making swashbuckling films that were blockbusters. This was made in 1938. This is taken in the commissary, which was The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn, Margaret Lindsay, and Melvin Cooper. And they're at the commissary. Okay, Cabin in the Cotton. Bette Davis showed up in the early 30s on Warner Brothers and made 55 films for them. She was famous not only for her parts that she played there, the roles, but also for her fights with Jack Warner, which were legendary. Jack Warner actually even she held out for on contract negotiations, went to England thinking she could break her contract. He sued her. They had a big, huge trial in England, and she was forced to come back to work. Yeah, and she was very powerful, though. She was actually known as the fifth Warner brother, and you didn't cross swords with her. Here's some old sets that used to be there. I really wish this would have been there when I was there. I mean, wouldn't that be cool just to run through that thing? It was torn down years ago, but this is called English Street. Now, the Warner Brothers were always probably the most forward-thinking of the studios, and they could see trends long before a lot of the other producers in Hollywood. This was one that they got right that they probably wish they hadn't. They were, of course, a Jewish-owned company. They had distribution offices in Europe in the 30s. And in one of their offices, I believe it was in Germany, Hitler's brown shirts broke in, busted up the place, and killed one of the employees. So they said, okay, we've got to alert America to what's really happening in Europe. So they made a film called Confessions of a Nazi Spy, starring Edward G. Robinson, which is actually a really good film. Still holds up. America was isolationist at that point, and what happened was Harry Warner was actually called in front of Congress to answer charges of creating hysteria. By the time he was going to be charged, though, Hitler invaded Poland, and they said, okay, all's forgiven. And once again, the Warner Brothers saw this coming before everybody else, which moves us into the 40s. Now, okay, it still had the name Warner First National Studios. It lasted until, I think, 51. You can look how, times have been good, even the Great Depression. You can see how many sound stages there are now. This area was all backlots, all right, about 8 acres worth. You can see the road has been changed now, and you can also see that you wouldn't notice this unless I pointed out, but they've built stages now along the highway. Used to be these were parking lots. I point that out because if you go to Warner Brothers now and you go to the Ellen show, that's where it's filmed, right there. The road now goes over the LA River. I don't think it did at this point. This LA River, before they paved it, used to wash out the bridge there all the time. Now, the Warners made a lot of war pictures. They were actually very patriotic. Their father actually had a PT boat named after him, the SS Benjamin Warner, because of all the contributions that Warner Brothers made to the war effort. A quarter of the personnel served in uniform. They contributed something like $20 million in bond sales, and they also gave a lot of plasma, like thousands of liters of plasma, things like that, and blood drives. But what's kind of funny is America kind of got tired of war pictures during the war, and they started coming back to other things, lighter fare to take their minds off of the war. One of them was, light plays like Arsenic and Old Lace. This was actually shot in 1941. It wasn't released till much later because it was still on Broadway, and they had a deal that they wouldn't release it until it went off Broadway. 1942, Casablanca. Now, great struggles can bring out the best in people. It can also bring out the best in studios. And I think proof of that is Casablanca, which is undoubtedly Warner Brothers' best achievement, probably Hollywood's best achievement, as a matter of fact. It should not have worked. Bogey, it's hard you can't think of this, but he had never been a leading man at this point. It was based on a play that was never produced. The writers really had no idea where they were going with it. They were actually writing it minutes before they handed it to the actors to perform. I point this scene from it, because this building right here, I believe, and I'm not 100% positive, but I'm pretty sure, this still exists. It's the only set that's still at Warner Brothers that you can see where Casablanca was filmed. This, I know that spot that I'm telling you about was used as the Paris Cafe scene, but it looks exactly the same here, and I think they use it again for, this is the Casablanca Bazaar scene. I think they use the same set. Now, this kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into the psyche of Jack Warner. Jack, this is the Jack and the Studio Chiefs. There's Jack, there's Harry, and Hal Wallace. He was the head of production for Warner Brothers at the time. Now, when it came time to get to the Academy Awards that year, they had a pretty good idea that the Oscar was going to go to Casablanca. So the actual producer of the film was Hal Wallace. He was the one who should have gotten the statue, right? But Jack Warner, he pulled a fast one. He had Hal Wallace sit in the middle of the aisle, and he sat on the end of the aisle. So when they called the name and the best picture is Casablanca, they both stand up, and Jack Warner runs up the stairs and grabs the statue, and Hal Wallace is left there going, you know, what do I do? And he sits back down. So Jack Warner stole the Oscar, basically, and he would never give it back. If you go to the museum, we have the Oscar there. There's a row of the Academy Award winners from Warner Brothers. And if you look really close, we're told that Jack held on to this thing all the time. It was like this was his totem. You know, he never let go of the Oscar. He was always holding it. If you look at it, the gold leaf is rubbed off of it. It's amazing. Hal Wallace actually left the studio because of this. He quit Warner Brothers and went and became a producer on his own and made billions. He was very successful, did a lot of Elvis movies. This is a great picture. This actually still exists. If you go to the studio, there's a store over here that if you take the tour, you'll go to. And then if you just come a little farther down, here's a monument that has all the names of all the people who served in uniform during World War II. On the top of it, there is a statue of the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. Back then, you could drive through there. And this is Gary Cooper. And what we didn't realize till we started doing these presentations, you can't really see it in the book, he's flipping everybody off. So he's saying, we're number one. Here's a commissary from the 40s. It's still in the same place. Looks a little different now. Here's some pictures. Ronald Reagan, one of the biggest stars on the Warner Brothers lot, died, he was born just over 100 years ago. He made 40-some films there. He actually, part of the backlot that exists now was made for one of his films called King's Row. It's still there. Peter Lorre, this was, I think, Passage to Marseille. I show this, this street still exists, called Brownstone Street. The museum I told you about where Kimmy and I docent is right over here. Here now is the Stephen J. Ross Theater, big, huge theater that they use for employee screenings, also for selling films to distributors, that kind of thing. I show you this film, this street, because it looks very different, especially this side. This side looks pretty much the same. You'll see in a moment. But this is 1940. Look up here. There's nothing up here, right? A year later, okay, this is looking south now. This still exists, Brownstone. But look at this. This big, huge behemoth that looks like it landed on Warner Brothers. Okay, this is Stage 21. I had never heard of Stage 21 because it doesn't exist now. But at one time, it was the biggest stage in the world. All right? I'll tell you what happened to it in a moment here, but let me show you some pictures of it. Here it is being built. Give you some idea. That's a guy standing there. Over here is, there used to be a depot at Warner Brothers where they would do a lot of their train filming. This is the inside of Stage 21. Now, when it came time to do the Seahawk, another Errol Flynn swashbuckler, they didn't have a stage big enough, so they built this thing for the Seahawk. And look here, they built ships inside there. That gives you an idea how big this is. There's actually two of them here. You can't see the other one. There is a pit that they dug here that was 12 feet deep. The reason they did that is so that stuntmen could jump off the ship and land in in the deep water without breaking their legs, because this water was only a couple feet deep. Here's a picture of what they filmed here. It's all done inside. Just amazing. Here's a picture of the same stage. Look over here. The ship's in dry dock. Amazing. There's another one over here. They're filming the Irving Berlin musical in the Army. That's what's happening on the stage. But yeah, this thing was massive. Also in I think I got the year wrong on this, but this was after the war, shortly after, maybe 1946. You have all these people coming back from overseas. They want their jobs back, right? And they want some of the record profits that Warner Brothers has been making. You got the people who were left there. They want raises that have been denied them for 4 or 5 years. The Moguls would have nothing to do with it. So there were riots in the street, literally. This is the Barham Gate I showed you, where the guys from Blazing Saddles are running out. That's the same gate, okay? This is Barham, Olive. You see some cars overturned. You see the cops shooting the rioters with water cannons, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of unrest with the workers there at the lot for a while. Actually, this happened all over Hollywood. There was a lot of unrest with a lot of the producers. Okay, we come to the end of the 40s. Now you see that the river's been paved. Wow. Over here, you still have the big back lots. This is stage 21. Look at that in relation to the other guys. These look like those Monopoly hotels, And here's the one that they raised 35 feet, so you can tell it's a little bit higher. And like I said, that's where you see the WB crest in the start of Warner Brothers movies on this side. And you see that also if you drive by, you'll see the big WB crest. But look at this thing. It was massive. You could put a couple of these inside of it. That's how big it was. There's another picture of it. I mean, it's just stunning how large this thing was. I had never heard of it. Doris Day, they did a lot of musicals again, lighter fare. They had to compete against television now, so they had to find their own way again. There were so many Westerns being made in this era, as we know. This is actually a this is actually a movie called The Left-Handed Gun with Paul Newman. All right. This was made there on the lot. Left-Handed Gun, Paul Newman. It was called The Left-Handed Gun because Billy the Kid was thought to be left-handed. Turns out they had gotten their information from, I think it was a glass slide they had turned around. Here's another film that they made back then, Shootout at Medicine Bend. I put this on there because Jack Warner, the Warner Brothers now had to compete against television, just like all of Hollywood did, and they were scared to death. And they tried to stick their head in the sands. Actually, they did see the future, just like they always had, and they said, okay, let's try to work with TV. But then they got scared, they pulled back, and they said, let's just hope it goes away. Well, of course, it didn't go away. And they eventually said, okay, we'll dip our toe in the television waters by making some Westerns. And one of them came out of this, Maverick kind of came at the same time. This is funny. This is, once again, Paul Newman. He made a film, his first film called The Silver Chalice. And here he is doing some photos with his co-star, Virginia Mayo. He was not proud of his work on this film. He actually called this the worst motion picture made in Hollywood during the 1950s. Okay, it isn't. He never saw an Ed Wood film, obviously, but he was never too proud of his work on this one. Okay, this another picture of the stage 21. This is the outside. There was actually a tank on the inside. There was also a tank on the outside for outdoor filming. If you look here, I just put this on there to kind of give you an idea how they would mess with your perception here. See the ship there? Look how tall it is. See the guy in the waders? Okay, it's just a little thing. Okay, you wonder what happened in 21? Well, here's what happened in 21. Warner Brothers had a problem, as all studios do, in that it dealt with a lot of combustible materials. Their old nitrate film would just spontaneously combust. Actually, they had a fire in the 1930s, and they lost something like 2/3 of every movie they ever made. They're gone, okay? Warner Brothers, I think, had a major fire every decade they've been in existence. One of the reasons is because you have these backlots, which are basically made out of tissue paper. I mean, they're just, false fronts. And you also have Griffith Park over here, which you get a brush fire, it's going to jump the river. This was one of the worst ones, 1952. They lost almost all of their backlots here. What didn't get lost, this was in May, got lost in July. Okay, there was a second fire, which claimed stage 21, which I don't think you can even see here, burned to the ground. They never rebuilt it. Now, if you go there, it's parking lot H. Some amazing pictures of these fires. I mean, here's some guys trying to battle the fire. A bunch of actors were called in to man fire hoses. Grab a fire hose. Let's put this thing out. Look at this picture. This is amazing. It looks like the burning of Atlanta in Gone with the Wind, but it's actually the backlots going, and there's a car sitting there. I mean, amazing pictures. They lost 8 acres of backlots, including stage 21. Now, coming to the end here, Warner Brothers was also on the forefront of the anti-hero, one of the biggest being James Dean. James Dean made only 3 films before he was killed in September of 1955. His most successful was Giant, which came out actually a year after he died. Now, Leon, who is here from SCV TV, and Alan Pollack and I, we actually made a documentary a couple years ago where we actually went and we met with the officers, the police officers who investigated his crash. And we also actually met with the police officer who gave him a ticket a couple hours before, a speeding ticket. What was really amazing talking to these guys, because these were the guys on the scene, right? Ernie Tripke and Ron Nelson. They didn't know who James Dean was. I mean, we think about James Dean as this big legend. He'd only made 1 film that had been released at the time of his death. Okay, that was East of Eden. He made Rebel Without a Cause, which came out a month after his death, and then he made Giant. Giant was actually the most successful of his films. It was actually Warner Brothers' most successful film of the 1950s. Here you see Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, also some of the producers, directors. This actually, James Dean was supposed to be there that day. He didn't show up. This was a luncheon they had there at the studio. He died just a few days later. Here's a picture of James Dean from East of Eden. I think I do have the year wrong on this one. This was actually 1954. If you go to the studio lot today, there's still a smaller backlot called Midwest Street. Midwest Street was actually the street they used in The Music Man when they do the marching. So you've seen it a lot. You'll see this church. This church was, we learned just recently, was called the Johnny Belinda Church. It was made for that film. More recently, it was used in The Witches of Eastwick and things like that. So you've seen this a lot of times. This is a very rare picture of James Dean there posing just in front of the church. And like I said, he was really not very well known. If you go to the museum, which I would highly recommend, there's a guy there named Eddie Boxer, who is one of the last people to actually work with Jack Warner and James Dean. He loved Jack Warner and he hated James Dean. So if you're there, make sure you don't say anything bad about JL or good about James Dean. He really didn't like the guy. All right. I think we're coming to the end here. All right. So we've just covered, as my book does, the first half century of Warner Brothers history. The 1950s was very troubling to the legacy of the studio. What happened was the Warner Brothers had started this big conglomerate, just 4 guys, 4 brothers who decided to work together. They pulled off a miracle. They built a massive studio in Burbank. They were incredibly wealthy. They had everything, seemingly. But the one thing that Jack Warner didn't have was he didn't have the title of president of Warner Brothers. One thing he did have, which he didn't want, he had a boss in his brother Harry. And he never liked that. It was one of those things that, he tasted bile about it his whole life. In the 1950s, he came to the Warner Brothers. Now they're elderly gentlemen now. And he said, okay, guys, to his brothers, Harry and Albert, okay, let's retire. Let's sell out, all of us together. So they put together this deal with some Boston backers, financial guys, and they all signed over all their shares to this new conglomerate. Well, Jack, he just after the ink dried on his brother's signatures, he had made a separate deal with these guys, and he bought all their shares and his shares back. So now he was the chief owner of Warner Brothers, and he was the president of Warner Brothers, something he'd never been. And his brothers were cut out of the deal. It was the final break in the real story of the Warner Brothers, because this ruined the family. They never reconciled. Harry had a stroke, and a couple days later, Albert actually never spoke to him again. Harry had a stroke, and Harry died from that stroke, and Jack didn't go to the funeral. But a couple days later, I think he was in the south of France. He was in a major automobile accident, which almost killed him. A lot of people in the family looked on it as divine retribution. But he lived to produce another day. He came back and he made films for another couple decade and a half. And then he finally retired in 1971. And he sold out the rest of his shares to a new conglomerate. Warner Brothers, of course, still exists. We know that. It's part of a much bigger company than what it was back then. It's no longer controlled by the Warner family. It's controlled by money men and stockholders. And the 50s is where it was no longer really Warner Brothers. It was a Warner Brother. This breach was never healed. If you go to the cemetery in East Los Angeles, I think it's the Home of Peace Cemetery. If you go on this side of the cemetery, you find the Warner Mausoleum, which has the brothers, the parents. You go to this side of the cemetery, you've got Jack. Well, I really appreciate you coming out today, and I thank you for your attention, and thank you very much.